Have you ever made a genuinely terrible decision, watched it just completely blow up in your face, and immediately blamed like bad luck or fate or maybe just the universe being out to get you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is basically the most natural human reflex in the world. When things go wrong, and especially when they go wrong because of our own actions, the immediate psychological defense mechanism is to just search for an external scapegoat.
Right. We want something outside of ourselves to point the finger at. A little demon on our shoulder, a systemic glitch, maybe a cursed alignment of the stars. It provides this clean, comforting narrative, doesn't it?
It does. It completely absolves us of the responsibility of looking at the internal mechanics of our own choices.
But today, we're looking at a text that pretty much strips away that comforting illusion entirely. We're doing a deep dive into a really specific piece of analysis from the Tolar Islam Digital Archive, specifically Lecture 11 out of 15.
Yes, and we'll be exploring an interpretation of Surah 16, Ayat 100, guided by the synthesis of Allama G.A. Parwez. And I have to say, the core premise presented here drops a rather massive conceptual bombshell.
It really does. It completely reframes the entire discussion around human autonomy, right?
Exactly. What Parwez presents in this lecture is a really thorough deconstruction of the idea of external compulsion. In the framework, he lays out what we might neutrally examine as a psychology of alliance. The concept of Shaitan is tackled head-on.
And just to clarify for the listener, Shaitan here is the symbolic representation of the destructive urge or the devil or just base irrationality.
Correct. And the argument is that this destructive force has absolutely zero independent leverage over human beings. None whatsoever.
Which is such a bold claim. I mean, considering how much of human history and literature is built on this idea of being tempted or literally forced by evil forces.
Oh, it takes it a step further.
Yeah.
It argues that this destructive force only gains power if you, the individual, literally sign a psychological partnership agreement with it.
Oh.
Yeah. So we're going to explore the mechanics of how Parwez believes human beings voluntarily surrender their autonomy. And, perhaps more importantly, we'll look at how he scales this up to the societal level.
Like how entire civilizations fracture when they try to run on conflicting operating systems.
Exactly.
And if you're listening and wondering how a mid-20th century lecture on ancient texts applies to your life right now, just think about the landscape we're all navigating today.
Oh, it's intense.
It is. We live in an era of unprecedented information overload. We are constantly swimming in sophisticated marketing algorithms, societal pressures that demand conformity.
Right.
So understanding the specific mechanics of how we inadvertently hand over the keys to our own minds, how we allow ourselves to be psychologically hacked, essentially that feels incredibly relevant.
It really is the ultimate psychological defense mechanism.
So let's unpack the mechanics of this argument, and I want to start with the language itself, because the source material spends a lot of time breaking down a very specific Arabic root word found in the text, which is sultan.
Yeah, this linguistic analysis is really the foundation of Parwez's entire argument here. In the context of Surah 16, specifically Ayats 99 and 100, the text explicitly states that the destructive force, the Shaitan, has no sultan over those who rely on the divine system.
Now, in common parlance, when we hear the word sultan, it carries a very specific, visual and historical weight.
Right, you hear sultan and you immediately picture a monarch.
An emperor, yeah. Someone with vast armies, total political control, raw physical power, basically the ability to coerce people into doing what they want through the threat of violence.
And that is the conventional historical usage. But Parwez unpacks the linguistic root of sultan within its specific Quranic context, and he extracts a much more nuanced definition.
Okay, so what is it in this framework?
Well, it does not mean physical force or coercive dominance. It translates more accurately to authority through proof.
Authority through proof.
Yes. It signifies a logical dominance, an undeniably sound argument that establishes a truth based on evidence and reason.
That significantly alters the traditional narrative. I mean, if we apply that definition, the text isn't saying the devil lacks an army. It's saying the destructive urge lacks a logical argument.
That is the absolute crux of the interpretation. The lecture argues that irrationality, by its very nature, just cannot prove itself. Falsehood has no inherent logical proof.
Because it can't stand up to the rigorous scrutiny of human reason.
Exactly. Therefore, any power that these destructive forces exert over us, whether that's, a societal superstition, an exploitative economic practice, or just an unchecked, aggressive emotional impulse, it's purely borrowed power.
Borrowed power. I like that phrasing.
Yeah, it's not inherent to them. It relies entirely on the authority we temporarily hand over to them when we suspend our own critical thinking.
I am fascinated by this concept of borrowed power. Let me try an analogy to see if I'm tracking the mechanics of this. Think about a modern digital phishing scam.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right. So you get an email that perfectly mimics the design of your bank's website. The subject line is entirely capitalized. It's warning you that your account has been frozen due to suspicious activity, and you need to click a link immediately to verify your identity.
A very common scenario,
Yeah.
and it's designed specifically to trigger a sense of urgency.
Exactly. But the reality is the scammer sitting behind a screen thousands of miles away has absolutely no actual access to your bank's secure servers. They possess no true authority.
In Parwez's terminology, they have no sultan.
Right. They cannot forcefully extract the funds from your account. Their only power, their entirely borrowed power, is their ability to manufacture panic.
Yep.
They bypass your logical firewall by triggering your fear, and in that state of panic, you willingly type your own password into their fake website. You are the one holding all the actual power. They just borrow it by manipulating your emotional state.
That analogy maps perfectly onto the psychological model Parwez is describing here. The lecture specifically points out that the destructive force operates through what it calls propaganda and manipulation.
Just inflating his wealth with yours, right?
Yes, the text uses that exact metaphor.
Yeah.
He has no capital of his own, so he uses your psychological capital against you.
So how does that actually play out in human behavior? Like, what are the emotional vulnerabilities that these forces target to bypass our reason?
The source material is quite explicit about this. It highlights states of frustration, despair, and unchecked aggressiveness. When a human being is consumed by severe frustration or anger, the intellect, the capacity to demand proof or sultan, is completely sidelined.
Oh, I see.
Parwez actually uses a really compelling metaphor involving a steam engine to illustrate this dynamic.
Oh, I love a good metaphor. Let's hear the steam engine one. How does it separate emotion from intellect?
So human emotions, according to this framework, are the steam. They are incredibly powerful, raw energy. They provide the necessary drive and momentum to act, to build, to survive.
Okay, steam is emotion.
But the intellect, human reason, is the steering mechanism of the engine. The intellect absolutely requires the steam to move forward. I mean, without emotion, there's no action.
Right, you're just sitting still.
But if the steam engine is running at full capacity and the steering wheel is abandoned, if emotion is driving without the guiding logic of the intellect, the result is massive, unpredictable destruction.
Oh, wow. So the destructive urge, the metaphorical shaitan, essentially just waits for you to be overwhelmed by the steam.
Precisely. It offers a false target for your anger or a temporary irrational comfort for your despair, and it prompts you to abandon the steering wheel.
It waits for the moment you stop asking for proof.
Exactly.
But, if these destructive societal norms, manipulative ideologies, or just irrational impulses rely entirely on borrowed power, it raises a significant question for me.
What's that?
Well, it can't just be a series of momentary, isolated lapses in judgment. For a destructive habit or toxic societal norm to maintain its grip on us, there has to be a more systemic mechanism at play. Like, how do we keep handing over our passwords day after day?
That is the logical next step in the lecture's progression, actually. And it brings us to the second half of Ayat 100. Parwez identifies a highly specific psychological mechanism embedded in the text, which he refers to as the consent clause.
The consent clause. It sounds highly contractual.
In a psychological sense, it is a contract. The verse stipulates that this destructive force only gains authority over those who take him as an ally. And the specific Arabic term unpacked in the lecture is tawalla.
Let's break down tawalla. What is the scope of that word in this specific context?
So, tawalla describes a process. It means to draw close to something, to actively befriend it, to align yourself with it, and ultimately to allow yourself to be dominated by it.
Wow.
Parwez argues that human beings actively manufacture their own shaitan. We create the very destructive forces that govern us by continually validating false traditions, entertaining superstitions, and excusing our own unchecked emotional outbursts.
We basically invite them to the table.
Exactly. We tell ourselves, oh, this minor compromise with irrationality is harmless. But the lecture argues that the moment you validate them, you grant them governance over your decision-making process.
So it's less of a sudden, violent coup of the mind and more of a gradual, hostile takeover that the board of directors actually votes to approve.
Yes, that's a perfect way to put it. It is a sanctioned takeover. And to illustrate how this momentum builds, The lecture provides a very vivid analogy involving a bicycle.
Oh.
Imagine you're at the top of a gentle downward slope on a bicycle. If you decide to ride down, you only truly have to exert muscular force for the first few pedal strokes. You make the initial conscious effort to push the pedals.
Right, but very quickly gravity and momentum take over.
And once that momentum builds, the bike is practically driving itself. And you are no longer the one doing the work. The external forces are doing it for you.
You're just along for the ride.
Parwez uses this to explain the psychology of Tawala. A small, seemingly insignificant compromise with irrationality creates psychological momentum.
Like telling a minor lie to avoid an uncomfortable conversation.
Or validating a superstitious practice because it's culturally expected, and it's just easier than pushing back. Or allowing an aggressive impulse to dictate your response in traffic because you feel momentarily justified.
So that's the initial pedaling.
Yes. But the framework argues that this quickly establishes a pattern, a momentum that culminates in total psychological domination. You have actively entered into the state of Tawala.
Okay, I follow the logic of the active choices, the conscious decision to push the pedals, but I really want to challenge this framework on behalf of the listener because human existence is rarely that clear-cut, is it?
It definitely gets complicated. Where are you seeing the tension?
What happens when someone is merely passively existing within a highly toxic or unjust system? Let's say an individual is born into a society built on extreme economic exploitation or just deep-seated prejudice.
Okay.
They aren't actively cheering for the system, right? They aren't drafting the oppressive laws. They are just keeping their head down, going to work, and trying to survive without making waves.
Right, the silent majority.
Exactly. In Parwez's framework, is that person actively consenting? Are they truly entering into Tawala with a destructive force simply by not fighting it?
That is perhaps the most crucial point of tension in the entire analysis. The source material actually addresses this exact scenario head-on.
Oh, it does?
Yes, and it does so by pulling in another very famous segment of the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, Ayats 256 and 257. This section begins with the well-known declaration, there is no compulsion in religion.
Right.
But Parwez focuses heavily on the conditions that immediately follow that statement, which discuss the necessity of rejecting taghut.
Taghut, that is a heavy term. How does the lecture define it within this specific psychological framework?
Taghut is defined here as any rebellious, non-divine, oppressive force, system, or tradition that demands your obedience.
So it could be an unjust political regime.
Yes, or a corrupt economic system, or even a deeply ingrained societal prejudice. And Parwez's interpretation is really uncompromising on this point. Passivity in the face of Taghut is mathematically equivalent to consent.
Mathematically equivalent.
The argument is that you simply cannot be neutral on a moving train. If the societal train is heading toward exploitation, simply sitting quietly in your seat means you are participating in the journey.
Wow. So merely failing to object is categorized as an alliance with the destructive system.
Yes. The text utilizes a really powerful metaphor of light and darkness to clarify this stance. The divine system, the objective truth, is described as an active force pulling people out of darkness and into the light.
And what is the primary function of light? It allows you to perceive reality accurately.
Exactly. The lecture gives an example. Imagine you are walking in pitch darkness. You might step on a piece of discarded rope, and in your inability to see clearly, your mind panics, convinced it is a venomous snake.
Oh, man.
Conversely, you might encounter an actual snake, mistake it for a harmless piece of rope, and attempt to pick it up.
With disastrous consequences either way. You are either paralyzed by an illusion or you're destroyed by a reality you completely fail to recognize.
And that is exactly how Parwez characterizes the dominant corrupt systems, the Taghut. They rely on keeping the populace in a state of psychological darkness.
So they require you to mistake ropes for snakes so that you remain compliant through fear.
Or they need you to mistake snakes for ropes so you engage in destructive behaviors without even realizing the danger. Actively bringing yourself into the light requires the courage to recognize reality for what it objectively is.
So if you choose to passively sit in the dark because it just feels safer than challenging the status quo, the lecture asserts that you are agreeing to the rules of the dark.
You are giving your consent to be deceived.
Man, that reframes the consent clause from a matter of active malice to a matter of urgent vigilance. It suggests that our default state, if left unchecked, is to simply absorb the operating system of whatever environment we happen to be in.
It really does.
But this leads to an interesting philosophical problem, I think. Why are these psychological laws presented as being so rigid? Like, why does passivity inevitably lead to destruction in this framework?
That's a great question, and the lecture actually takes a rather unexpected pivot here to answer that. It moves away from human psychology for a moment and delves into the mechanics of the physical universe.
Wait, really? The physical
It
universe?
does. It broadens the scope significantly to explain the underlying mechanics of these laws. Parwez references Surah Fusilat, Ayat 53. This verse discusses the concept of the divine displaying signs in two distinct arenas.
Okay, what are they?
The first is in the horizons. The Arabic term is afok, which refers to the outer physical universe. And the second is within themselves, the term infus, which points to inner human psychology and consciousness.
Okay, to put that in modern academic terms, AFOC encompasses astronomy, theoretical physics, chemistry, biology, basically the hard sciences.
Yes,
And ANFOS encompasses psychology, sociology, ethics, and morality.
that is an accurate mapping of the terms.
Yeah.
And the profound argument Parwez constructs here is a theory of absolute unification.
Unification of what?
He posits that the laws governing the physical universe, gravity, thermodynamics, electromagnetism, and the laws governing optimal human psychology and societal structure originate from the exact same source. There is no distinction in their fundamental nature.
I want to pause and really examine this because it directly challenges the foundational assumptions of a lot of modern thought.
It really does.
I mean, how can the laws of physics and the laws of human morality be categorized as the same type of law? They seem to operate in completely different realities.
Well, the lecture clarifies this by looking at the role of discovery. Consider the scientific method, right? A theoretical physicist does not invent the law of gravity or the speed of light.
Right, they don't draft legislation to make thermodynamics exist.
Exactly. Their role is entirely observational and analytical. They discover a law that was already operating perfectly, long before human beings even existed to observe it.
Okay.
Parwez argues that within the Quranic framework, the laws regarding human behavior, economics, and social justice are not arbitrary moral tests designed by a deity to see who behaves well.
They aren't.
No, rather, they are presentations of fundamental social and psychological realities. They are discoveries of how human beings optimally function, identical in nature to how physics discovers how matter optimally functions.
So if I walk off the edge of a 3-story building, gravity doesn't pull me down because it's judging my character.
Right.
Gravity isn't punishing me. I simply suffer the natural, inevitable consequence of violating a fundamental physical reality.
That is the exact parallel the source is drawing here. It argues that the moral and social laws operate with the same objective cause and effect mechanism.
So if a civilization constructs an economic system based on extreme wealth hoarding, exploitation of labor, and systemic injustice,
The resulting societal collapse, the poverty, the crime, the eventual revolution isn't a magical supernatural punishment inflicted from the heavens. It is a natural, predictable consequence of violating the fundamental laws of human social physics.
wow, you built a bridge with faulty engineering, and it collapsed under its own weight. This highlights a massive schism in how we currently view the world, honestly. If you look at the philosophy of science over the last few centuries, we have constructed a very thick wall between facts and values.
We have.
We generally accept that science dictates the objective facts of the universe, how atoms bond, how cells replicate, but we tend to view values, questions of ethics, justice, how we ought to treat one another as entirely subjective.
Yes.
We treat them as human inventions that can shift and change depending on cultural preferences or historical eras.
And Parwez diagnoses this specific schism, this attempt to divorce the objective physical laws from the moral laws, as the root cause of modern societal instability.
It's the root cause.
Yes. The lecture suggests that if you operate under the assumption that the physical universe is bound by a set of unified, unbreakable laws, but human society can be run on whatever subjective whims or exploitative theories we happen to invent, you create a fatal contradiction in your perception of reality.
You're basically attempting to run a unified universe using a split operating system,
Perfectly said.
which provides a seamless transition into the core diagnosis of the entire lecture, actually. This concept of a split operating system, the attempt to hold two contradictory sets of truth simultaneously, is the foundation for how the source completely redefines one of the most heavily loaded terms in the text.
Yes, the concept of shirk.
Exactly.
This section in the lecture is perhaps its most radical departure from traditional interpretations. We return to the conclusion of Ayat 100, which issues a strong condemnation of those who commit shirk. Now, if you survey traditional theological literature, or even ask a layperson, the definition of shirk is almost universally understood as associating partners with God.
Yeah, the immediate mental image is very literal and very ancient. Someone bowing down in front of a stone idol or offering a sacrifice to a statue of a localized deity. It feels like an antiquated historical practice that has little bearing on a modern, secularized world.
But Parwez explicitly moves the definition away from that literal historical imagery of statues and shrines. Utilizing the framework of what we've been calling social physics, the lecture redefines shirk as the act of dualism.
Dualism.
It is a psychological and structural dichotomy. It is the unsustainable attempt to balance two fundamentally conflicting tendencies at the exact same time. The source describes it as a split personality disorder that afflicts both the individual psyche and the overarching structure of a state.
I want to make sure the mechanics of this are crystal clear for the listener. Let me expand on an analogy to illustrate this idea of a split personality at a structural level.
Go for it.
Imagine you are tasked with manufacturing and operating a highly complex piece of machinery, like a commercial Boeing airliner. The engineering demands absolute cohesion.
Obviously.
But instead of working from one unified master blueprint, the manufacturing firm gives the engineering teams two entirely different, contradictory sets of blueprints.
Okay.
Half the engineers are instructed to build the wings and the fuselage strictly according to the objective laws of aerodynamics and fluid dynamics.
Okay, standard physics.
But the other half, they are told to build the engines and the navigation systems based on the rules of a fantasy novel, where propulsion is achieved by hoping really hard and navigation is based on reading tea leaves.
Well, the result is entirely predictable.
The machine will tear itself apart the millisecond you attempt to turn the ignition. The systems cannot communicate. The physical forces will conflict, and it will result in a catastrophic failure.
That analogy perfectly captures the structural argument Parwez is making regarding human society. In the terminology of the lecture, you cannot operate a civilization simultaneously on the law of requital, which Parwez defines as the objective cause and effect divine justice system based on equity,
Right.
and the law of whim, which represents human emotional volatility, selfish desires, and the pursuit of exploitative power. If you attempt to mix these two blueprints, the gears of society inevitably grind to a halt. The internal contradictions destroy the structure.
The blueprints simply do not match. You can't have half the plane following physics and half the plane following magic.
And the lecture provides a very sharp, pointed critique of how this specific dualism manifests in the contemporary world. It pays particular attention to the tension between modern religious practices and secular governance.
Oh, this is going to be interesting.
The source makes the provocative claim that shirk, this systemic dualism, is the dominant operating mode of almost all modern societies.
How does the text argue that modern societies are committing this form of shirk?
It happens through categorization. The lecture argues that societies commit shirk when they take divine or moral law and relegate it entirely to the realm of personal law.
Meaning what, exactly?
This means moral law is only applicable to private worship, household rituals, and personal piety within the walls of a mosque, church, or temple. Meanwhile, the society runs its public law, which dictates its political structures, its economic policies, and its justice system on secular, man-made systems that are often rooted in exploitation, the maximization of profit, and the law of whim.
Ah, the classic division of church and state, but taken to a psychological extreme. It's the societal equivalent of saying, my personal conscience dictates how I treat my family, but the ruthless logic of Wall Street dictates how I run my business.
The lecture explicitly states that this division artificially severs the unity of human life. You are living a structural dichotomy. You are attempting to serve two entirely different masters, operating under two mutually exclusive sets of rules, depending on what day of the week it is or what building you are standing inside.
That sounds exhausting.
The source argues that this inevitably fractures the individual psyche. It generates massive, unsustainable cognitive dissonance.
The psychological toll of that is incredibly relatable, I think, for anyone functioning in the modern economy. Picture the typical corporate professional.
Okay, let's look at them.
On Sunday, they might attend a service at their local place of worship. They engage in practices centered around deep empathy. They donate to charity. They meditate on the inherent dignity and equality of every human being, regardless of their status. They operate on a blueprint of compassion.
A blueprint aligned with the law of requital and mutual care.
Exactly. But then Monday morning arrives. They commute to a corporate environment that functions as a zero-sum game. To secure a promotion or ensure the company's quarterly growth, They are required to operate on a completely different blueprint.
They might have to exploit loopholes.
Underpay subordinates, aggressively outmaneuver colleagues, or sell products they know are actually harmful. The psychological gymnastics required to justify both of those realities, to genuinely believe you are a saint on Sunday while operating as a ruthless shark on Monday, is staggering.
It is.
And the source is identifying that exact cognitive dissonance as the modern, lived manifestation of shirk.
And the source underscores that this condition is not just mentally exhausting for the individual, it is structurally fatal for the society. The psychologists would term it a split personality, right?
Yeah.
The individual loses their internal cohesion.
Yeah.
And when an entire society is built upon this foundation, when it continuously broadcasts high moral values about human rights and dignity, yet simultaneously engineers an economic engine that systematically starves and exploits an underclass, it is engaging in a macro level of shirk.
It is bowing to the idol of unmitigated profit while offering empty lip service to moral law.
Precisely.
So if we trace the logical progression of the lecture thus far, we started with the realization that falsehood relies on the borrowed power of Sultan.
Right.
We explored how we grant that power through the passive consent of Tawala, and we've now seen how trying to balance the truth with that falsehood results in the psychological torture of shirk.
Yeah.
The inevitable question is, where does this breaking point lead? If a society is suffering from this massive split personality, how does that tension eventually resolve itself in the real world?
This brings us to the final and undoubtedly the most historically charged and complex section of Parwez's analysis. To understand how this dichotomy resolves itself, we have to look at how it manifests politically. This requires us to examine the lecture's radical redefinition of the concept of apostasy, known in Arabic as Irtidad.
I want to push back pretty hard here, because to a modern listener, this feels like a massive, jarring leap.
How so?
We have spent this entire deep dive discussing internal psychology, cognitive dissonance, and the philosophical alignment of natural laws. Now we are suddenly introducing apostasy, a term that historically carries the weight of inquisitions, religious persecution, and violence over personal beliefs.
It's a heavy word.
Usually we define apostasy simply as someone changing their mind about theology. They wake up one day and say, I used to believe in this specific deity, and now I don't.
That is the standard, modern, secularized definition of the word. It views faith entirely as a private, internal mechanism. But Parwez argues vehemently against applying that definition within the specific framework of the Quranic system.
Why is that?
We have to remember the context we just established regarding the unity of laws. In a unified system, where the outer laws governing societal economics and the inner laws governing personal morality are viewed as a single, cohesive blueprint, Irtidad cannot be reduced to a mere change of personal opinion.
So what is it then?
The lecture frames Irtidad not as theological doubt, but as high treason against the constitutional system of the state. It is categorized as an active, structural rebellion against the specific laws that hold the society together.
Hold on, we need to reconcile this. Early in the lecture, Parwez heavily emphasized the consent clause and quoted the verse, "There is no compulsion in religion."
He did.
He established that true belief cannot be forced, it must be a voluntary alliance with the light. But if apostasy is defined as treason, and treason is typically met with force by a state, how does the source justify that without completely contradicting the no compulsion rule? You can't say you are free to choose and then arrest someone for choosing differently.
It is a critical tension, and the lecture addresses it by providing a very specific historical case study to illustrate the difference between theological belief and constitutional adherence.
What's the case study?
The source focuses on the tumultuous period immediately following the death of the Prophet, during the administration of the first Caliph, Abu Bakr.
A period characterized by massive instability and the potential collapse of the nascent community.
Precisely. Several tribes across the Arabian Peninsula began to rebel against Medina. Now, the traditional simplified narrative often frames these events, the Ridda Wars, as these tribes suddenly losing their faith in a purely theological sense.
Right, that they just stopped believing.
But Parwez points out that the core grievance of the major rebelling tribes was not theological, it was economic.
Economic.
Specifically, these tribes refused to pay the zakat.
We need to clarify zakat here. In modern parlance, it is often translated simply as personal charity, putting a few dollars in a donation box. But in the context of the early Medinan state, it functioned entirely differently, didn't it?
It was not a voluntary, private, charitable donation. In the structural blueprint of that society, Zakat was the central economic mechanism of the state. It was a mandatory wealth tax designed to prevent the hoarding of capital and ensure the equitable distribution of resources to the vulnerable.
Oh, I see.
The rebelling tribes did not declare that they no longer believed in the concept of a single God. They did not reject the spiritual teachings. Their argument was essentially political and economic.
Which was what?
They basically said, we pledged allegiance to the Prophet while he was alive, but we do not owe allegiance to Medina's treasury now that he is gone. We will still call ourselves Muslims, we will still perform the prayers, but we are keeping our wealth. We are seceding from the central economic system.
I see. This brings the airplane blueprint metaphor back into stark relief.
It does.
They wanted to keep the wings of the airplane, the spiritual identity, the communal benefits, the label of the unified system, but they wanted to rip out the engine, the structural economic demands. They wanted the benefits of the community while running their financial lives on the law of whim.
Exactly. They were attempting to sever the public law from the personal law. They were operationalizing shirk.
By refusing to abide by the central economic constitution while simultaneously demanding to maintain the label of the unified system.
Yes, they were functionally attempting to break the state apart. Therefore, Parwez argues that Abu Bakr's decision to utilize military force against these specific tribes was not a religious war designed to force them to hold a specific theology in their hearts.
Because that would indeed violate the no-compulsion mandate.
Exactly. It wasn't about policing their thoughts. It was about preventing the collapse of the economic infrastructure.
Yes. It was a state action to put down a secessionist rebellion that directly threatened the constitutional survival of the community.
In this framework, they were guilty of Irtidad because they were committing active treason against the structural integrity of the system, not because they were experiencing a private crisis of faith in their living rooms.
It is the ultimate historical manifestation of partial belief. And this ties directly back to a very severe critique found earlier in the Quran, which the source material frequently references Surah Al-Baqarah, Ayat 85.
Yes.
That verse harshly condemns individuals or societies who choose to believe in certain parts of the book while deliberately rejecting other parts.
And why do they engage in this selective belief? The lecture suggests it is almost always driven by economic or political self-interest.
They treat the divine system like a cafeteria buffet.
Yes.
They look at the blueprint and say, I will happily take the comforting personal rituals, the sense of community, and the promise of spiritual peace, but I am going to pass on the strict mandates regarding economic justice, the prohibition on usury, and the requirement to redistribute my hoarded wealth. Thank you very much.
The lecture highlights the profound, destructive hypocrisy of this buffet approach, particularly in how it manifests in the modern era. Parwez offers a scathing critique of capitalist models that attempt to dress themselves in religious or moral garb.
That is a very pointed critique.
The source points out the fundamental absurdity of constructing an economic system that structurally guarantees poverty, a system that relies on exploitation, wage theft, and vast inequality to function, only to turn around and encourage the beneficiaries of that exploitation to offer charity to the victims in order to earn religious merit.
It is the equivalent of a system systematically breaking a person's legs and then expecting the victim to feel profound gratitude when the system hands them a subsidized pair of crutches.
And worse, the individuals handing out the crutches claim they are fulfilling the divine law by doing so.
Unbelievable.
The lecture argues that this is the absolute zenith of believing in part and rejecting part. A society rejects a fundamental structural laws that demand baseline economic equity, implements a blueprint based on the law of women exploitation, and then utilizes the charity aspect of the divine law as a PR mechanism to alleviate their own guilt and make themselves feel righteous.
The level of psychological self-deception required to maintain that system is staggering. It requires an entire society to permanently exist in the dark, mistaking the snake for a rope.
And what is the inevitable result of maintaining this illusion? The lecture is unambiguous on this point. Attempting to extract bits and pieces from a unified system simply to serve your ego or your bottom line, while explicitly discarding the structurally demanding elements, the elements that require actual sacrifice and systemic equity, always results in disaster.
It has to.
The text states that this dualism ultimately leads to worldly humiliation and severe internal societal conflict. You simply cannot construct a stable, enduring civilization on a foundation of hypocrisy and split operating systems.
Eventually, the structural contradictions become too great, and the society collapses under the weight of its own shirk.
Exactly.
This has been an incredibly dense, challenging, and frankly mind-bending journey through the source material. We began by looking at our instinct to externalize blame, only to realize that the destructive forces we fear, the symbolic Shaitan, the societal manipulation, the bad habits, only possess the power we voluntarily cede to them. They operate entirely on the borrowed power of Sultan.
And we examine how that borrowed power functions through the consent clauses to Allah. We saw that because falsehood lacks logical proof, it relies on us pedaling the bicycle downhill. And we confronted the difficult reality that passivity is equivalent to consent. Sitting quietly in the dark means you are agreeing to the rules of the dark and aligning yourself with the target.
We looked at the profound argument that the laws of human society are as objective as the laws of physics, that the inner and outer universes share a single blueprint.
And finally, we explored how violating that single blueprint results in shirk. We reframe shirk not as antiquated statue worship, but as the highly destructive social physics of dualism. It is the hypocrisy of trying to live a double standard, which historically manifested in the Irtidad of demanding the spiritual label of a righteous system while violently rejecting its structural and economic demands.
It forces you to evaluate the architecture of your own life and the society you live in through an entirely different and much more rigorous lens. We've seen that the choice of authority is entirely ours. In Lecture 1215, covering Ayat 101, we will see the reaction of the traditionalists when the authority of the Quran changes, why they cry forger when the law evolves to a higher stage of human development.
That is going to be a fascinating continuation of this historical and psychological analysis, looking at how entrenched systems react to structural evolution. But before we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave the listener with a final practical thought to mull over based on everything we've unpacked today.
Please do.
We spent a significant amount of time discussing how passivity equates to consent and how easily we absorb the dominant systems around us. So I invite you to examine your own daily routine. What invisible terms and conditions did you implicitly agree to when you woke up this morning and engaged with the world?
That is a phenomenal question. We click agree on digital terms of service every day without reading them, but we rarely think about the psychological terms of service we accept just by participating in our current societal structures.
Exactly. Look closely at the parts of your life that feel the most chaotic, the most stressful, or the most prone to destructive patterns. And ask yourself with brutal honesty, am I attempting to run this specific part of my life using two conflicting blueprints?
That's powerful.
Am I demanding a simple, external diagnosis, a literal demon to point the finger at when I am, in fact, the one holding the pen and actively signing the partnership agreement with the very forces that are exhausting me?
We all want the clean break. We all want the easy external diagnosis that absolves us of the hard work. But sometimes the most profound and empowering psychological defense mechanism we can possibly develop is simply the terrifying realization that we hold the keys to our own minds. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.